Libertarianism is pro-immigration, pro-market, pro-trade.
More competitive, less centralized.
Not military confrontations, but peaceful interaction.
The war on drugs has been actually an unmitigated disaster.
I want to thank Dominic Malusi in particular because he initiated, I think, the invitation to come. So thanks to Dominic as well. And thanks to all of you for coming. We're going to talk about John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company tonight, but I first want to say a little bit about the organization I'm with in the hopes that you may be interested in attending one of our programs or visiting our website. I'm with the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE. Our website is fee.org. And in recent years, we have undertaken immense growth in both impact and output. Our focus is on high school and college age students in particular. And we educate and inspire them in ideas of individual liberty, private property, free enterprise, and we think most importantly, personal character, because everything we think flows from that. The character of a people will determine its destiny, as well as all the little things like the shape of their economy and the things they do as a people together. So that's a little bit of our mission, and we host seminars for students all over the world. Probably 90% of what we do is within the U.S., but we do a lot in overseas countries as well, with Brazil and Poland being the two countries where we have seen the greatest interest in FEE's work. The most reposts, translations, and other uses of our material. And our big event every year is in Atlanta, the biggest event. This year it'll probably draw 1,000 people, with college students in particular from all over the world. It's called FEECon, F-E-E-C-O-N, and it's going to be June 13 through 15 in Atlanta. And although the entire program isn't finalized just yet, there's a lot of it that you can read about, and you can begin to register if you're interested in coming. Sam, you were there this last year, right? Yeah, so, and you're planning to come back. Oh, yes, so you totally appreciate that. So it isn't just a seminar of 3 days of lecture, as you will testify to. It's full of entertainment. We had a fantastic violinist from Venezuela. Were you there for that moment when he played? Yeah, had everybody in tears. He was able to flee socialist Venezuela, and after being arrested many times by the government and thrown in prison, he got out in time to come to perform at our seminar. Now he's performing on the streets of New York, and is delighted to be in a relatively free country. And anyway, that's the caliber of speaker or performer that we typically bring to that big event. So I hope you'll look online at fee.org, learn more about that conference and other things that we do, fresh content every day of the week, and I think you'll be excited about what you see. Tonight, we're going to talk about a real boogeyman, at least of the statist left, of those who favor a progressive or socialist approach to the economy. They think of John D. Rockefeller as one of the reasons they believe in what they do, because people like John D. Rockefeller and other robber barons will run roughshod over people. If you give them a chance, they'll grow rich at other people's expense or do all kinds of awful things to get there. And they think there's no better example of that than the company he built, the famous Standard Oil Company. I want to set the record straight, tell you what I think John D. Rockefeller should be best known for. And I'll tell you right up front, I think he's a hero. Somebody that we can look up to because of the wealth that he created from scratch. There is a common myth that's been accepted widely in America for generations, that the latter part of the 19th century, 1850 to 1900 roughly, was the time of these so-called robber barons, these men typically who became very rich by building empires. And in the course of building those empires, they did some awful things. And they somehow make a case for things like antitrust or busting up companies or some kind of regulation or another. And the feeling also is common among those who believe that, what I think is a myth, that the American economy, until the progressive era in the early 20th century, was becoming increasingly monopolized, centralized, and so we had to have government come in and save us from all that. But I want to refer you to a historian who did some pretty definitive work on this. His name is Gabriel Kolko, K-O-L-K-O. I think his best book was called The Triumph of Conservatism. And it gave rise to what we call now the Kolko thesis, which is that contrary to the myth, the American economy in the last half of the 19th century was becoming more competitive, less centralized, less monopolized, that there was more competition in the American economy in that period than ever before. Now, there are certainly examples, some at the state level, some at the federal, where certain business people use their political connections to get some kind of favor or protection or immunity, or to have the government go after their competition. There are examples of that, just as there are today, a lot more today than there was back then. But by and large, Kolko's thesis, and I think it's accurate, is that the American economy in this age of the so-called robber barons was becoming more competitive, less centralized, less monopolized. And Rockefeller's performance at Standard Oil actually gives us plenty of evidence of that. I have to give you some background to explain what was the environment into which the Standard Oil Company and others like it emerged. How many people here know, or let me ask you, do you know what the American people were using for lighting, for fuel, for lighting in their homes for the first half of the 19th century? How did we light our homes when we didn't set them on fire by accident? Yes?
Wasn't it whale oil?
Exactly, it was whale oil. And we've been using whale oil for many decades before that. As late as 1850, Americans overwhelmingly were using the oil from whales to light their homes. But there was a problem with that. Whales were, in effect, kind of common property, giving rise to what economists call the tragedy of the commons, suggesting that when something is commonly held, as opposed to being privately held, people don't take care of it. And that was the case with the whales. They were commonly held. There was every incentive to go out and kill them and use their blubber or use their whale oil, but nobody had either the incentive or at that time, I think, the technology either to sort of husband them and grow them like we do cattle. There was never concern about a shortage of cattle, right? And that's because they're not commonly owned. They're privately owned. People have an incentive to take care of them, husband them, use them for the right purposes, and grow their number if demand for them increases. So we were burning whale oil in our homes at a time when our economy, our population were both growing rapidly. It was true for many other countries. And the supply of whales was not increasing. If anything, they may have been going down. So what do you suppose that was doing to the price of whale oil as the 1820s, 30s, and 40s wear on? It began to rise. And believe it or not, at that time, we didn't have a federal Department of Whale Oil or a federal Department of Energy to kind of manage this problem into expensive perpetuity. Instead, we just let markets solve the problem for us. And as the price of whale oil rose, reflecting the increasing demand and scarcity of whales, a couple things happened. On the demand side, as the price rose, some marginal buyers dropped out. A marginal buyer might be somebody who says, you know, maybe I really don't need that jug of whale oil. I think I got a couple candles in the attic I can dust off and put them to use. Or maybe I'll start reading when the sun's still shining instead of after dark. I mean, there are various ways that facing a higher price, almost anybody can find ways to conserve. But the most important effect of the rising whale oil price was on the supply side. As the price of whale oil rose, industrialists, prospective entrepreneurs, people who were looking for opportunities to serve customers and make a buck themselves in the process, they began to look around thinking, hey, you know, there's money to be made if we can find a substitute, if there's something we can sell to people to use in place of whale oil, and if we're there first with it, we can make money. Well, what will that be? I suppose maybe candle makers try to make a few extra sales, but the most important factor was that it was just known for a long time, but sort of people began to wake up to it, that on the creeks of northwestern Pennsylvania, there was this oily substance that kept showing up. The Indians would use it for war paint and things like that. And we found that it could burn. And we started to wonder, can we find this stuff from wherever it comes, apparently deep within the earth? Can we bring it forth in great quantity at a reasonable cost? And can we market it, maybe even improve its quality through what we now call refining, and make it a good substitute for whale oil? So a lot of people were experimenting with this, but and we didn't know at first how to find where it is or how much it could be found in beneath the earth and how to bring it forth. But there was a guy in 1859 by the name of Edwin Drake. How many have heard of him before? Any Pennsylvanians here? Ah, okay, so you know, yeah. I went to school in Titusville where he drilled the first well. He was a Connecticut guy that a group of businessmen out there, venture capitalists, said, hey, why don't we hire you we'll send you to Pennsylvania, you see if you can find where this stuff's coming from and if we can bring it forth in some reasonable, large quantity at a reasonable cost. He came to northwestern Pennsylvania, punched a bunch of holes in the ground, and he was down to about a few $100s when the businessman in Connecticut said, come on back, if you haven't found it, we're not gonna sink any more money into this. He insisted that it was to be found, he could do it. He spent all the remaining pennies that he got from them, went into a little bit of debt himself, and just when that was about to run out, he struck oil, and it was a classic gusher. I mean, massive outpourings of it. It took them a while to stop the oil from coming forth in this gusher. And with that discovery, the oil rush was on. We think of the oil rush as maybe something that happened in Texas. Well, it did, but a lot later. The original oil rush in America was in northwestern Pennsylvania, a little bit into Ohio. Okay? Everybody and their brother, it seemed. In fact, later John D. Rockefeller will testify in Congress and make that statement. He said in these early years, it seemed like everybody was in the business. Everybody was poking holes. If you look at old pictures of mountainsides in Pennsylvania from like the 1860s and 70s, I've seen somewhere, if you look at them this far away, it looks like a wooded mountainside. You look close and you realize those aren't trees, those are derricks that people have dug a well and built a derrick there, and they stuck them all over the place. Well, what were they producing that became the alternative to whale oil? It wasn't just crude oil. You couldn't burn that very cleanly anyway. They were refining it into what became known as what? Anybody know?
Kerosene.
Kerosene, yeah. That was, in fact, it's kerosene that John D. Rockefeller will build his, quote, empire on. That's the alternative. It's a refined oil product, the alternative to whale oil. I love to say, especially to an audience, and I know we don't have an audience of socialists here tonight, but if they were here, I love to say, you know, you should love John D. Rockefeller because he saved the whales. More than anybody else, more than Greenpeace, he saved the whales by, he wasn't the first to dig a well, but he figured out how to do it better than anybody else, and that's why he made a lot of money. Well, lots of people are in the business at first, and into the picture in the 1860s comes this guy, John D. Rockefeller. We are so accustomed today to thinking of that name as synonymous with great wealth, we don't recall quite often that wasn't the way it started out. John D. Rockefeller, the first of them, was not a wealthy man. He was a bookkeeper, he was a grocer, he was a Sunday school teacher, a very faithful tither too, I might add. He kept meticulous records you can still see to this day at one of his homes in not far from the old fee office in Westchester County. You can go through and see